Welcome to the MacMillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Howard Dean. An alumnus of the class of '71, he has returned to Yale as a senior fellow at the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs to teach a seminar on the politics of foreign policy. Many of us are familiar with Mr. Dean from his run for the presidency in 2004. Prior to that, he served as Governor of Vermont for 6 terms from 1991 to 2003. Mr. Dean was elected as chairman of the Democratic National Committee in 2005, serving until 2009. As chair, he was lead strategist, spokesman, and fundraiser for the DNC. Mr. Dean is credited with pioneering an energetic 50-state strategy and the development of 21st century campaign tools that helped Democrats make historic gains in the 2006 and 2008 elections. Before entering politics, he was a practicing physician. Mr. Dean currently works as an independent consultant focusing on the areas of healthcare, early childhood development, alternative energy, and the expansion of grassroots politics around the world. He also continues to be active in the Democratic Party politics. Today we'll talk with Mr. Dean about foreign policy in the Ukraine, Iraq, and Syria. Welcome, Mr. Dean.
Thanks for having me on.
You are here at Yale teaching a course about foreign policies. So basically, you review the domestic political concerns or pressures and how they are affecting U.S. foreign policy since World War II. Are you looking at these countries now? I know it's very early in the semester, but are you looking at Syria and the Ukraine and Iraq and what's going on today?
We're starting actually now with Iran and Iraq, and the domestic policy is considerable. The domestic influences on these. The domestic influence for the Iranian situation goes back to of course, the famous hostage situation, which went on for over a year.
With Jimmy Carter?
When Jimmy Carter was president, and then Ronald Reagan on his inauguration day, where they were freed by the Ayatollahs. And that still is very much of a political football. It's very difficult for President Obama to have any kind of an opening to Iran without enormous pressure from the right using this anti-Iranian sentiment in the United States, which goes back to those days. But the truth is, and the kind of thing I like to talk about in class, is our difficulties with Iran went back a great deal longer than that. In fact, were of our own making. In 1953, the British deposed the only democratically elected prime minister in the history of Iraq, elected by Parliament, I might add, not by the people of Iran, excuse me. And that, had we not done that, history might have been completely different. So there are lots of very complicated aspects, and one of the things I really try to stress in dealing with all of American foreign policy, particularly in the post-war era, is that there are short-term decisions that are made, and they don't always turn out well in the long term, and I'm trying to encourage as much long-term thinking about American foreign policy as possible so that we don't make stupid short-term mistakes and then find that we're paying a huge price for them later on.
Isn't it difficult to take the long view sometimes, depending on what's going on and what the political pressures are?
Sure, the political pressures always encourage people to take the short view, and in fact, our electoral system always encourages people to take the short view because they're always worried about the next election.
Exactly.
But there have to be some people with big pictures, either capability of having a big picture view, or, like Harry Truman, a willingness to do things against the political grain. I grant you that one of the big sources for the Truman administration was McCullough's biography of Truman, which is absolutely spectacular. And I think he has a very idealistic view of Truman, but nonetheless, Truman was somebody who made very tough decisions without regard to the politics, particularly, for example, in the firing of General MacArthur. And those kinds of decisions have stood us very well. Truman, despite his fact that he never went to college, was completely in the dark about most everything that Roosevelt was doing when Roosevelt died and he became president. Turns out to be a monumental figure in American history, particularly post-war history, because under his administration, almost every major institution of the post-war era was formed, and not just simply because of Truman, but because of the people around him and the people and the relationship he had with people like George Marshall and Dean Acheson.
Well, let's look at some of those areas of the world today. The Ukraine, for instance. What should be the long-term picture there instead of the short-term?
Well, the long-term picture, of course, is largely going to be determined by Vladimir Putin. What Putin's clearly trying to do is destabilize Ukraine in a way that will allow him to have the kind of influence that he had when President Yanukovych was in power, who was basically a corrupt, for wanting of a less diplomatic word, fool, who was doing whatever Putin told him to and making lots of money doing it. And the reason for that was that Putin has some, I would say, perhaps delusions of grandeur, and also some of the traditional sort of paranoia of Russian foreign policy, some of it which was, of course, well-deserved, well-earned. And this vision of this sort of greater Russia, that he was somehow going to go back to the old Russian Empire at the height of, or Soviet Empire at the height of its reach, and it's not true. There are probably some things we have done that made it more difficult for us, but largely it's Putin's. They're the next door neighbor. If Putin wants to disrupt Ukraine, he's going to be able to do that successfully, and we have to make him pay a price for it in the long term. I actually think President Obama's policy in Ukraine is exactly right. This gradual tightening of sanctions is much more effective than anything else we could do.
Right, okay. What about Syria and Iraq?
Much more complicated. Iraq, of course, was doomed the day that George Bush sent troops there. And I actually said that 11 years ago, almost, well, not quite to the day, but I predicted 11 years ago that if we sent troops to Iraq for reasons that turned out not to be true, which I suspected at the time, based on British intelligence that I was looking at, if we went to Iraq, we, first of all, would strengthen Iran immeasurably, and second of all, Iraq would be divided into three countries, Kurdistan, Shia Iraq, which would be heavily dependent on Iran, which has happened, and I also predicted that Al-Qaeda would come in and use eastern Iraq, or western Iraq as a base, and I was wrong on that one. It was ISIS instead of Al-Qaeda, but still a very dangerous terrorist group. So, the die has been cast, and we now, and the president has to live with the folly of what I think was I used to say the largest debacle in American history and the biggest mistake, although you'd have to say the War of 1812, where we got our capital burned down, might have been greater. But this was a disaster, and now we're having to clean up this horrible mess, which actually can't be cleaned up. George W. Bush changed the geography and the balance of power in the Middle East in ways that are bad for the United States forever, and that can't be undone. But there are some things we can do.
Like what?
In the future. First of all, I think the president's negotiations with Iran are a good idea. I think they won't succeed, but I think they need to be done.
Why don't you think they'll succeed?
Because I think the Iranians are playing for time. The sanctions are very, very effective, and what Rouhani, who is not a moderate at all, is intending to do is to buy time, get the economy back on its feet, which is happening to a certain extent, but does not intend and could not from his own political problems domestically, give in or give up the potential of having a nuclear weapon. I don't think that's a winnable goal. Nonetheless, I think talking is better than shooting, and so I think that the president has done the right thing in that area.
What about the bombings we're doing? Do you think we should be doing that?
We have to. We have no choice. I think the president is also right with that. We cannot have boots on the ground. We made that mistake in Vietnam and paid a terrible price for it. We made the mistake in Iraq and paid a terrible price for it. You cannot defend with American troops on the ground a country that doesn't want to defend itself. We defended corrupt dictators in Vietnam on the idea that it was anti-communist, which turned out not to be true. It was actually a nationalist problem. We defended, we propped up Maliki. We've propped up Karzai. Both of them are corrupt people. People who won't fight for themselves don't deserve to have American boots on the ground. It's not going to be successful. Air power, I think, is successful. My view of what should happen in Iraq is that we need to work with the Kurds, who are very motivated to have their own country. We should recognize Kurdistan at some point, not now, but at some point. And that needs to be the core of the ground troops that will fight against ISIS. And we should support them vigorously by air.
So So in terms of the beheadings that ISIS are doing, and looking for the bigger picture, and also the political pressures that are, there's a lot of public sentiment that wants to bomb now with the beheadings. I mean, what do you think the larger, longer picture should be?
The longer picture is, as long as you don't have American casualties, there'll be support for that. While academics and others on the progressive end, which includes me, and I mean that's usually where I am, condemn the drones. I think drones are essential because I think drones are a substitute for boots on the ground. These people are terribly dangerous, and this notion that somehow you can repel evil and violence without using violence yourself, it would be nice if the world were like that, and I really genuinely wish it were, but it's not. I just heard a stunning report on the BBC on the way over about a young man from Kosovo, a country that I've spent a lot of time in, who was indoctrinated and brainwashed by ISIS and just blew up 15 or 50 innocent people in a suicide bombing. And then he also, there's another Kosovo kid, unemployed, seduced by ISIS, went to Syria and publicly beheaded a Syrian soldier. These people are dangers. They're dangers to the world, they're dangers to us, and we have to use whatever means necessary to get rid of them.
I mean, it strikes me as it's a very grassroots kind of campaign that they're running, which is very different from other kinds of military operations, I think. I mean, how do you combat something like that? Someone going into a crowd and blowing them up? How do you stop that from happening?
It's very, very difficult to do that. The Israelis are probably the best at it, and even they're not 100% successful. You have to have great intelligence. You do have to have
which is something I think we're lacking in this country, yes?
It's getting better, but having human intelligence is very hard, and that's what we're missing. We're relying too much on technology.
Right.
But we are, we have, fortunately, knock on wood, headed off major attacks on the homeland of the United States. That's important. You also have to do preemptive things, and you have to be very careful, because if you become an authoritarian state yourself, then of course you really do create more potential recruits for ISIS or other terror groups like that. There was just a raid in Kosovo rounding up kids who were becoming extremists. And in this country that probably wouldn't be allowed. You're probably allowed to think and say extremist things as long as you don't actually carry them out. In other countries, they have less of a tradition of First Amendment traditions and Fourth Amendment traditions, and measures like that are going to be necessary.
Right. So, if you were dictating foreign policy, what would be some of the things that you would put into effect?
Well, nobody can do that, including the president.
What would you try to do?
Well, see, I actually think that President Obama's foreign policy is very good. He's getting the daylights beat out of him by liberals and conservatives alike. But what he has done is to articulate a policy that began with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it was never really articulated, partly because President Clinton was very involved in stopping genocide in Bosnia and some things like that. President Bush believed in a unipolar world, which turns out, of course, not to be realistic. What this president has done is articulate something that's been developing since the collapse, which is the notion of a multipolar world where alliances are the mode of action. And he articulated that in his West Point speech, which most people didn't pay any attention to, partly because it wasn't that well delivered, and partly because the media doesn't pay attention. There's not much serious media anymore. There's some. But I've seen very little written about the Obama doctrine. And the Obama doctrine, I thought he laid out very well, which is that we will have partners, that we will cooperate to protect human rights and to expand the ability of people to be free and to create their own democracies if they wish, and that we will respect elections. I think Obama gets very little credit for recognizing President Morsi in Egypt. Now, I wouldn't want President Morsi as my president. He's basically a religious demagogue and was heading Egypt towards a non-democratic religious state. But he was democratically elected. And if you adhere to a democratically elected philosophy, then you have to respect people's elections. I thought Gates made a very good point in his book when he criticized President Obama and Vice President Biden for moving the Afghan election forward by a few months because when Karzai was reelected, because a variety of reasons and they didn't have the right candidate and so forth. You can't do that. If you're preaching democracy to other people, you have to, the Constitution is absolutely critical, and you have to stick to the Constitution and have the elections when the Constitution says, not when it's convenient for whatever reasons. Right. But the basic notion here is we want to foster democracy, and we're not going to do it unilaterally anymore. It's not possible to do it even if we had the power.
Okay. So what would you like your students to take away from your class? The
most important lesson is big picture. Stan McChrystal did a guest appearance as the president in a simulation last week, and he was spectacular, as he always is. And his big lesson was you've got to think of the big problems, not the little problems. It's not just about that somebody is about to attack some ship or somebody's moving troops here and there. Those are the short-term little problems. What does this say about the changing relationships between nations, and particularly between the United States and other nations? And the most important lesson of all that I hope to impart in the 13 weeks that we have is, first of all, in order to make decisions, you have to understand culturally where other nations are coming from, because we no longer live in a unipolar world where we can tell them what they have to do. We have to take their interests and considerations into serious consideration. And most importantly of all, and this Stan actually said it this way, I want to know that if I make a decision today, what's going to happen 6 months from now? Am I going to be regretting this decision? We absolutely have to take a long-term view. We have to think about where we're going to be in a year or 2 years or 3 years. I don't think we would have gone into Iraq if we had seriously considered how much it was going to benefit Iran to have American armies take out Saddam Hussein. And if we had known how much it was going to benefit Iran, I don't think we would have. But I don't think anybody looked at that, because they were all looking at short-term stuff. They were all ideologically motivated. That is the worst basis of foreign policy that there could be.
Looking down the road, where do you think things will net out in Iraq and the Ukraine and in Syria?
I think Iraq and Syria are finished as countries. This is the remodeling of the Middle East by forces in the Arab world, as opposed to the British and the French, who remodeled the Middle East after World War I according to how they wanted to draw the maps. And so that's going to happen, and it has already essentially happened. I think Ukraine is going to be a long, difficult haul. Putin, as he has in Georgia with the taking of Abkhazia away from Georgia, will, I think, try to continue to destabilize Ukraine. I think it's going to be, I hope these sanctions work, and I think they have a good chance at working, but it'll be a long-term struggle, not a short-term struggle.
We had such, I thought we had such a decent relationship with Putin, and all of a sudden, you know, it turned. Why do you think that happened?
I think you're going to have somebody in this program who's an expert on Russia, which I'm not. And Mike McFall, whose book we're going to use a little later in the course, is an expert on Russia.
It just seems so peculiar to me.
I don't think it's entirely peculiar. I think, first of all, Putin's an autocrat. Second of all, he's basically taken away most of the democratic institutions which were sprouting in Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Secondly, I think you have to culturally understand sort of the paranoia of Russian foreign policies going back to Peter the Great in order to, and thirdly, you have to understand the humiliation that the Russians felt, which is of course encouraged by Putin for his own political reasons, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. They somehow feel entitled to own Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. They don't have a democratic tradition, so they don't particularly respect the right of the Lithuanians and the Latvians and the Estonians to do what they want, and they think the same of the Ukrainians. And they have a peculiar view of history which is warped by their own propaganda.
True. It just seemed for a while to be moving in the right direction, and then it took a very wrong turn.
I think if Medvedev was still president with any power, it would have gone in the right direction. Putin is just the wrong guy at the wrong time. Remember, he is a trained KGB agent.
Yes,
and I don't think he's ever escaped that past, and unfortunately we're not now escaping it either.
Yeah, unfortunately old habits die hard, I think. Okay, final question I have to ask. I've read that you are interested in running in 2016 for the presidency.
I am not.
You're not?
No, I'm supporting Hillary Clinton.
Okay. Well, I had to ask.
I think even though Hillary would be an exception to this, usually you don't go back a generation. I think Obama turned the page to a new generation. I think if Hillary doesn't run, rather than my running, I think it should be somebody like Kirsten Gillibrand or somebody from a new generation. But I do think Hillary's the most qualified person in America to be the president, and I'm happily supporting her.
Very good. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me on.
For more information about Mr. Dean, please visit our website at yale.edu/MacMillan Report. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the MacMillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.